Hi, Misha here, and as promised, we come to the Soviet BRDM. Have both the Dash 1 and Dash 2 variants to talk about. This is a light armored reconnaissance vehicle, scout vehicle, that was designed from the outset to be fully amphibious, at least for freshwater, that kind of thing. Quite an interesting vehicle for its day and time, and was pretty much the first of its class in the 1950s. And it's kind of a take on the old World War II armored cars and what have you. So with that, we'll dive in. As usual, these are 1/72 scale diecast, sold in Russia under the Fabry name, sold in the US under the Eagle Moss brand. At any rate, here we have an early BRDM, later known retroactively as the Dash 1. Yeah, it's an amphibious armored car. Now, in World War II, Russia did have a couple of dedicated armored scouts like the BA-64, but these were out of date and out of production. Post-war, they tried using the BTR-40. It's kind of a jack of all trades. Light APC, reconnaissance vehicle, scout. It was a somewhat more modern vehicle, but it was, not terribly well suited, and it was not amphibious. And post-World War II, nations were kind of reevaluating the role of reconnaissance. Some, like the US, they didn't really see the need for such a vehicle. On the other hand, some like France really liked it, and Russia kind of fell in the middle. They wanted light armored scout cars, but they also wanted them to be fully amphibious so they could cross a good deal of terrain. Also, they wanted them to be able to cross snow and mud because Russia. So since the BTR-40 wasn't working out, in 1954 work began after the government specified what they wanted. It needed to be able to hold up to 5 crew, at least get up to 80 kilometers per hour, and essentially just be economical and fully amphibious. So work began, and they actually started with the BTR-40 as a basis, the chassis, and it was known as the BTR-40P, but it was a pretty thorough, complete rework or redesign. The first prototype was ready in late 1955, and first testing began around and even on the Black Sea in February of 1956. And in 1957, this vehicle was adopted for the Red Army as the BRDM. And the first version was actually without a roof. It could have a tarpaulin put over the top, but it was pretty much open like a Jeep. And also the first version, also known as the Model 1957, wasn't typically armed. The next year, the Model 1958 would introduce a roof along with 4 hatches, but still no armament. In 1959, a pintle mount would be added for a 7.62 machine gun. And then in 1960, 2 more side pintle mounts would be added. And you start to see in late production versions, some are fitted with 12.7 machine guns, and even very late versions could have a 14.5 millimeter machine gun. But yeah, so there's several changes early on. As far as the vehicle itself, it's actually gasoline powered. It has a Gaz copy of a Dodge truck engine in it. It's able to get up to about 90 kilometers per hour on road. Overall, it's about a 5.6 ton vehicle, give or take the exact version. And it measures about 5.7 meters long, so over 18 feet. It's, not small. It has 4 main wheels, but also underneath it has 4 more auxiliary wheels that are chain driven that are there for added stability if crossing mud and all that good stuff. Moreover, it has a fully welded hull with rolled steel armor for weight. The armor is only about 10 millimeter thick, but on the other hand, it does have a kind of a boat shape front to it for water, and it actually has a water jet in the rear to move through water. So it is pretty well set up for that. In the water, it can do about 8 to 10 kilometers per hour. So a lot like the later BMPs and BTRs. Typically, the actual crew is 2, commander on the right in the front and driver on the left. But then in the back, the rear compartment or rear seat can hold up to 3. These can be soldiers, they can be reconnaissance specialists, or even just officers for communication. There's even an anti-tank version that replaces the back seat with a rack of anti-tank missiles. A few different styles were used. Since it was originally an open-topped vehicle, it did not have nuclear or biological protection. And originally it didn't have night vision or anything like that. Pretty basic, frankly. It was basically a truck that could go through water carrying up to 5 soldiers, and later was able to mount machine guns, although it didn't always. It just kind of depended. It did have some basic armor, but a weak point were always the wheels. They were not protected, which is a little unusual because earlier Russian armored cars from the 1930s and 40s did have cork or foam rubber in their wheels to kind of make them, if not bulletproof, at least run flat resistance. It's worth pointing out that the engine is in the front here, with the crew compartment in the rear, meaning it's set back a good ways. The crew has a total of 4 hatches, at least in the version that has a roof. And that's really about it. Pi has a trunk. It was just a reconnaissance vehicle that could get through any terrain, and it was quickly introduced into the Red Army, and production would continue for almost a decade, ending in 1966. And it would stay in frontline Red Army service through the late 70s. They would build about 10,000 for Russia, plus another 1,500 for export. And these were exported, not just to Eastern European nations. Poland and East Germany obtained quite a few, but Egypt and Syria also obtained quite a large number, and they were used both in the 6 Days War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973, both against Israel. And the Israelis would capture several BRDMs, eventually giving some to the USA for study and, enemy practice. They would also make it over to Asia, for example, in North Korea. And at one time, as many as 50 nations had some of these, including in Africa. They saw quite a bit of use in Africa. When the Red Army was kind of done with theirs, they gave a lot away as secondhand war aid between the late 60s and 70s. And so they saw some combat use in Africa. Into the 21st century, they were still being used by about a dozen nations, but by current times, only a couple of nations still have them, and only a couple of hundred are still in inventory. So it's virtually out. And that's because while it had some advanced features, it also had some major shortcomings. Hence why we ended up with the BRDM-2. BRDM stands for Combat Reconnaissance Patrol Vehicle. But the original version was that, but it didn't have any specialized reconnaissance observation gear, wasn't armed from the get-go, didn't have NBC protection, night vision. In some ways it was a small APC or a large Jeep that was able to go through water. But the BRDM-2 tried to address this and kind of really make it fulfill its role when its name called it out to be. The original, which was originally just known as the BRDM, was retroactively named -1 to distinguish it from the later version. The idea to create it started way back in 1958-59, and they got serious around 1960. And they wanted to correct some issues. And to some extent they did. It is a better actual scout reconnaissance vehicle with more dedicated equipment and probably a little more combat worthy here. Overall length is virtually the same. The -2 is just a tiny hair longer, but it's actually much heavier. Again, the -1 was about 5.6, 5.7 tons. The -2 is 7 tons or a little more. And they both have a similar top speed, but slight improvements there. Both are four-wheel drive with the 4 auxiliary wheels for a total of 8. Pretty similar in a lot of regards. The armor protection is similar. Like I said, the -1 had 7 to 10 millimeters. The -2 is still mostly 7 to 10, although the front is increased a bit to about 14 millimeters, so a little bit better armor protection. And we do have a boxier, redesigned hull. So let's get into what they changed. By the way, both of these were manufactured by Gaz, at least initially. The -1 was sometimes called the BTR-40P, and sometimes the -2 was referred to as the BTR-40PB or BTR-40P-2. So we have a pretty big change in the sense that the engine was relocated from the front to the rear. It has its own compartment now, and it's actually separated from the fighting compartment, the cab, by an armored barrier, a firewall, if you will. So the engine is better protected, and if something happens and it ignites, the crew is better protected. It's still a gasoline, but it's a V8 now instead of a 6-cylinder. So it is a little bit faster, up to 100 kilometers on road, and 10 or 11 kilometers over water. And it can actually propel the vehicle over water for anywhere from 15 to 20 hours. Pretty good there. Still uses the water jet in the rear. Still has essentially unarmored tires, unfortunately. It is nuclear and biological protected with a sealed cab. But now we have a crew of 4. We have a driver and commander in the front. But instead of having room for 3, basically just whatever people in the back, this has more of a set crew. We have a gunner, and we have a radio operator. Now, a radio is very much a standard equipment, other comms equipment. When the vehicle is going around, the gunner stays in the back of the hull, but if he needs to, he can hop up into this turret, and that's probably the biggest, newest feature. They remove the rear hatches, and now there's just the front 2 up here, but now we have this turret. It houses a 14.5 millimeter machine gun with 500 rounds, as well as a 7.62 millimeter machine gun with up to 2,000 rounds. And that's standard equipment. Like the -1, there was also an anti-tank version redesigned to carry anti-tank missiles. Now that's, generally speaking, a positive to have a turret with 360 degrees, because one of the big deficiencies with the -1, even for the later versions with machine guns mounted on top, to actually use them, fire them, the crew had to pop out of a hatch and man them. Now at least the gunner has some protection about 10 millimeters of armor. Better than nothing, that's for sure. But the trade-off is it does make entering and egressing the vehicle more difficult. Not only do we not have the rear hatches, now with the machine gun traversing over where the front hatches go, you probably want to be mindful of what it's doing lest you get whacked in the head. Which means in a battlefield situation, exiting the vehicle if it catches fire is more problematic. But that said, it does have quite a few advanced features compared to the original, and they were produced concurrently. This was introduced in 1962, and Dash 1 production was not halted until 1966. And the Dash 2 was not revealed to the public until that year, and it would quickly replace the Dash 1 in the Red Army. And eventually other vehicles as well. And these would be exported to about 3 dozen nations. So not quite as many as the Dash 1, but still a good number. And they would produce these in large numbers, but not quite as many as the first one. About 7,200 were built. And there would be 3 kind of production series or batches from 1962, with the last ones leaving the factory around 1988, 1989. And they fulfilled the same roles you would expect in the Dash 1. Some pros, some cons. Still was a gasoline engine, which has some detractions versus diesel. Ergonomics were pretty crap, riding comfort, but the crew was better protected, and it was a more capable vehicle for both scouting and reconning. By the way, this turret was later installed on the BTR-60PB, which we've already talked about, and would be carried over to the BTR-70, and would even influence the turret on the BTR-80. But it was originally designed for the BRDM-2 here. Kind of neat, I thought. And that's about it. Otherwise, it actually really does remind me a lot of a World War II Russian armored vehicle, just bigger and badder in a way. And these are still in service with several militaries, including some officially still in Russian service to this day, although they're being replaced by newer vehicles, of course. Now, these would serve alongside the BMPs later on and the BTRs. Sometimes they would be replaced, but in other ways, they would definitely find a role in the battlefields of the 70s and 80s. And for a time, the U.S. really didn't have anything quite like it, just because they chose not to in the 40s and 50s. Yeah, has its purpose. These models are kind of neat. They're inexpensive, $9. Rolling wheels, moving turret on this one. Like I said, this is an early Dash 1 variant. Don't know. Quite heavy duty metal. Kind of reminds me of a Matchbox car. But with that, I thought we would talk about these, since we've mentioned so many other vehicles and they kind of fit right in, and show you really how Russia had this thing for amphibious vehicles. It just was always very important to them. But all told, when you count kind of all the versions, they built 19,000 of these. Not insignificant, and they saw combat all around the world in dozens of nations' militaries. So, pretty neat for that. Well, with that, let me know what you think. Please feel free to comment, and as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.